The morning light spread gently across London as Buckingham Palace came alive with tourists from around the world. The tall black gates shimmered in the sun, and the sound of clicking cameras filled the air. People were laughing, taking photos, and admiring the royal guards in their bright red uniforms and tall black hats. Among them stood Corporal James Turner, one of the most disciplined and respected guards on duty. His eyes looked straight ahead, his posture perfect, his face calm and unreadable. James had been serving as a royal guard for nearly 10 years. He was known for his focus and strong sense of duty. Nothing ever distracted him. Not the noise, not the weather, not even the playful attempts of tourists trying to make him smile. His job was to stand completely still, to represent strength and discipline. The Queen's Guard, as they were called, was one of the most iconic symbols of Britain, and James took that role very seriously. That morning, though, something unusual caught his attention. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a small figure among the crowd. It was a little boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, wearing a blue jacket and holding a small toy car. The boy was standing close to the fence, looking around with wide eyes. At first, James thought the child was simply admiring the guards like everyone else. But as minutes passed, the boy's expression changed. His tiny shoulders started to shake. His lips trembled. Then came a quiet sob. James tried not to react. He knew the rules. Guards do not move, speak, or break formation unless there is a threat or an order from a superior. Still, the sound of that soft cry reached deep into his heart. It reminded him of his own son, Ethan, who was about the same age when he once got lost in a busy market. James could still remember that day. How terrified Ethan looked when they finally found him, and how tightly he clung to his father's uniform. Now, as he watched the lost boy in front of Buckingham Palace, James felt a similar ache in his chest. The child's small hand gripped the bars of the gate, his little face red with tears. He looked around desperately, calling in a weak voice, "Mommy? Mommy, where are you?" People in the crowd began to notice. A woman nearby tried to comfort him, bending down to ask his name, but he pulled away, too frightened to speak. A man took out his phone, maybe to alert security, while others simply stared, unsure what to do. The palace guards stood tall as always, their eyes forward, their discipline unbroken. But James could feel the tension building inside him. Every instinct told him to stay still. Every human feeling told him to act. Minutes passed like hours. The little boy's cries grew louder. The cheerful energy around the palace faded, replaced by uneasy whispers. "Where's his mother?" someone said. "Poor thing, he's lost." Another voice added, "Why aren't the guards helping?" James's hands felt heavy on his rifle. He knew that if he moved even an inch without permission, it could be considered breaking protocol. There were cameras everywhere, tourists recording, reporters often around, palace officers monitoring from a distance. A royal guard leaving his post without order was a serious matter. Yet what he was seeing wasn't just a situation, it was a child in distress. Inside his helmet, his jaw tightened. His mind flashed between memories of training in the face of his son. His duty was to protect. That was what the uniform meant. To guard, to serve, to keep people safe. But wasn't that little boy a part of the people too? Wasn't protecting a frightened child also part of that same promise? The boy clutched the bars harder, tears running down his face. His toy car slipped from his hand and fell to the ground. For a moment he just stared at it, as if that small object was his last piece of safety. Then he began to cry again, calling out louder, "Mommy!" Please, the crowd grew more restless. A few tourists began to move closer, but the palace security rope stopped them. The nearby guards, still at their positions, shared brief, uncertain glances. None of them moved. They were all trained the same way, to be statues of order and honor. Yet deep down they felt the same helplessness. James could no longer ignore it. His heart was pounding beneath the red fabric of his uniform. He looked straight ahead, but his thoughts were spinning. He remembered what his commanding officer once said during training. "In service, there will come a day when your heart and your orders will not agree. On that day, you must decide what kind of man you are." This felt like that day. The sunlight glinted off his polished buttons as he took a slow, deep breath. The air around him seemed to grow quieter, as if the whole world was waiting to see what he would do. The little boy was still crying, his voice trembling with fear. Every sound of that child's sob felt like a hammer against James's chest. He couldn't take it anymore. He made a decision, not as a soldier, but as a father. Not as a guard, but as a man with compassion. He knew there might be consequences later, but at that moment, none of it mattered more than the child in front of him. James's right hand moved first, barely noticeable, but enough to draw a breath from someone nearby. Then, breaking one of the oldest rules of royal duty, he stepped forward. The sound of his polished boots hitting the ground echoed through the crowd. People gasped. Cameras turned instantly toward him. A royal guard was moving, something few had ever seen. Inside his mind, everything slowed. He felt the weight of his decision, but he didn't stop. His heart guided his steps. His eyes softened as he looked down at the boy. For the first time that morning, he spoke. His voice was calm, deep, and reassuring. "Hey, little one," he said softly. "It's all right. We'll find your mom, okay?" The boy blinked up at him, eyes wide in surprise. The moment felt almost unreal to those watching. A royal guard speaking, breaking silence, bending to comfort a child. It was something no one expected. The boy sniffled, wiping his face with his sleeve, then nodded shyly. James crouched slightly, careful not to alarm the others, and extended his gloved hand through the fence. "It's all right," he repeated. "You're safe now." The boy reached out hesitantly and took his hand. For the first time in what felt like hours, his tears began to slow. The crowd, silent now, watched a simple but powerful act of kindness unfold before them. The other guards didn't move. They knew the rule had been broken, but they also knew, deep inside, that James had done something right. Compassion had overcome protocol. The palace courtyard was quiet except for the soft cries of relief from the child. The boy looked around again, whispering, "Mommy." And as the sound of hurried footsteps approached from across the plaza, James knew this moment was far from over. Something greater was about to happen. Something that would remind everyone that even behind the strictest discipline, there is still a human heart that beats with love. And as the mother's voice echoed faintly in the distance, calling her child's name, James felt a wave of hope rise inside him. He stood tall once again, knowing this morning at Buckingham Palace would soon become a story that touched hearts far beyond those gates. The morning sunlight fell softly over Buckingham Palace, warming the stone walls and glimmering off the golden tips of the gates. Tourists crowded along the fences, holding up phones, whispering excitedly, and laughing as they watched the famous royal guards. Their bright red uniforms and tall black hats looked majestic in the clear light. To most visitors, they were part of a perfect London postcard. Tall, silent, unshakable. Among them stood Corporal James Turner. He was a man of few words and strict discipline. 10 years in service had trained him to stand still for hours, no matter the noise or distraction around him. His eyes were sharp, his back straight, his hand steady on his rifle. Behind his calm face was a man who believed in rules, order, and honor. Every motionless moment, every deep breath was part of his duty to the crown. Yet deep inside, James was also a father. His young son, Ethan, had just turned 6. Every time he left for work, Ethan would salute him in front of the door and giggle, saying, "Stand still, Daddy." It was a game to his boy, but to James it was a promise. He wanted his son to see that discipline could be beautiful, that standing strong could mean something noble. That bright spring morning began like all others, but then James noticed something small and out of place in the sea of tourists. Near the black iron fence, a tiny boy stood alone. His blonde hair shone in the sunlight, his hands clutching a small blue toy car. He couldn't have been older than 5. His eyes searched desperately through the crowd. At first, James thought the child was just curious, but then he saw the little boy's lip tremble. A moment later, tears rolled down his cheeks. James's heart tightened. The sound of the child's crying cut through the chatter of the tourists. "Mommy, Mommy, where are you?" The boy sobbed. His voice was soft but filled with panic. People nearby turned their heads, some stepping closer, unsure of what to do. James's training whispered in his mind, "Hold your post. Do not move. Do not speak." He had repeated that rule countless times during drills. Guards did not react unless under threat. But this was not a threat, it was a frightened child. The boy's small shoulders shook as he cried harder. He dropped his toy car on the ground, the sound sharp in the still air. A few tourists tried to help. A woman crouched beside him, speaking gently. "Are you lost, sweetheart? What's your name?" But the boy only backed away, his eyes filled with fear. The crowd murmured, uncertain. James felt his heart beat heavier. His mind flashed back to a memory. Ethan, lost in a crowd at the city fair 2 years ago. He had only been missing for a few minutes, but for James and his wife it had felt like forever. He could still remember the relief of seeing his son's tear-streaked face running toward him. That memory now burned in his chest as he watched this boy cry outside the palace. The rule was clear. He must not move. Yet what kind of protector could stand still while a child sobbed only a few feet away? His hands tightened on his rifle. He stared straight ahead, every muscle in his body tense. The sunlight glinted off his brass buttons, but all he could see was the little boy alone and scared. The child's cries grew louder. "Mommy, Mommy!" His voice broke, echoing off the palace walls. People began to record with their phones. "Poor kid," someone said. "Why isn't anyone helping him?" James's jaw tightened beneath his bearskin hat. His inner voice argued with itself. "You can't move," it said. "It's against orders." But another voice, softer yet stronger, replied, "He's just a boy. He needs someone now." A nearby guard shifted slightly, his eyes flicking toward James. No one spoke, but they all felt the same silent question. Who will do something? Finally, James made a choice, not as a guard, but as a father, as a human being. He drew a deep breath. The air around him seemed to still. Then, with steady purpose, he took one step forward. The sharp sound of his boot on the stone ground made several tourists gasp. Heads turned. Cameras zoomed in. A royal guard was not supposed to move, but James had already decided that some moments were greater than rules. He took another step, his shadow falling over the boy. The child looked up, startled, his crying quieting for a moment. James bent down slightly, careful and gentle. His voice, deep but soft, carried through the noise. "Hey there, little one," he said quietly. "Don't cry. We'll find your mom, all right?" The boy blinked, his tears slowing. The crowd around them fell silent. Even the other guards watched, frozen in disbelief. A royal guard speaking was rare enough, but kneeling? Never. Yet here was James, the picture of royal discipline, now breaking centuries of protocol for the sake of a scared child. The boy sniffled, his small hand trembling. James offered his gloved hand. "You're safe now," he said kindly. "Stay close." The child hesitated, then reached out. His tiny fingers touched James's hand, finding comfort in that simple gesture. For a moment the world seemed to stop. The tourists, the guards, even the city itself, all silent witnesses to a small act of humanity that meant everything. James straightened slightly, keeping the boy close while scanning the crowd. "We'll find your mother soon," he whispered. His voice was calm, but inside emotion swirled. He knew what this meant. He had broken one of the most sacred traditions of his post. There could be questions, maybe even punishment. But at that moment, he didn't care. All he could think about was a terrified little boy who needed someone to care enough to act. Somewhere in the distance, James thought he heard a woman's voice calling a name, faint, but growing closer. The boy's eyes widened, recognizing it. He turned his head, his face lighting up with sudden hope. James stayed still, holding the boy's hand, his heart steady now. The voice came again, louder this time, filled with panic and love. "Oliver! Oliver!" The crowd began to stir, looking in the direction of the voice. James knew that the moment was about to change again. The mother was coming. Relief washed over him. For now that was enough. He had done what his heart told him to do. And as the boy squeezed his hand one last time, James realized something simple but powerful. Sometimes true honor isn't about standing still. It's about knowing when to move. The sound of the woman's voice grew louder as she ran through the crowd, her face pale with fear. "Oliver, Oliver!" she called again, her voice breaking between each cry. The little boy's head shot up, his eyes wide with hope. He turned toward the sound, dropping James's hand for a moment. "Mommy!" he shouted back, his tiny voice filled with relief. The crowd began to part as the woman pushed through, her steps uneven and fast. She was young, maybe in her early 30s, wearing a long beige coat and holding a handbag that swung wildly as she ran. Her eyes searched desperately until they landed on her son standing beside the royal guard. The sight made her stop in shock. For a second, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. A palace guard who was supposed to remain still, kneeling beside her lost child. Tears welled in her eyes. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees and wrapping her arms tightly around the boy. "Oliver, oh, thank heavens! I thought I lost you," she cried, pressing his small head against her chest. The boy buried his face in her shoulder, his little arms clinging to her neck. "I'm sorry, Mommy," he sobbed. "I couldn't find you." "It's all right, darling," she whispered through tears. "You're safe now." The people watching around them smiled softly, their faces filled with emotion. Some even wiped their eyes. A few whispered, "That's beautiful," while others murmured in amazement about the royal guard who had broken formation to help. James stood quietly now, watching the reunion. His face was still calm, but inside, he felt a deep warmth spread through his chest. The boy was safe, the mother was found, and for the first time in his 10 years of duty, James felt the true meaning of service. It wasn't just about standing tall or following orders. It was about humanity, about protecting people in their moments of fear. The mother looked up at him, her face still wet with tears. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." James gave a small nod, not speaking at first. Then in a quiet voice he replied, "I'm just glad he's safe, ma'am." She smiled through her tears. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "You broke the rules, didn't you?" James looked down for a moment. "Sometimes," he said gently, "doing what's right matters more than the rule." The woman pressed her hand to her heart, touched by his words. The crowd began to applaud softly, a ripple of clapping spreading across the courtyard. The sound grew louder, echoing against the palace walls. Tourists from every corner joined in, clapping not just for the reunion but for the quiet bravery they had just witnessed. James didn't move or bow. He simply stood tall again, returning to his position by the gate, rifle by his side, face calm once more. But inside his heart was still racing. He knew what he had done would not go unnoticed. Cameras had caught every moment. Palace officers were likely already aware. There could be questions later, maybe even disciplinary action. But as he watched the mother lift her son into her arms and hold him close, he knew one thing for sure. He would never regret this day. A few minutes later, a senior guard approached from across the yard. His footsteps were firm and quick. The crowd grew quiet again. The man wore a slightly different uniform, marked with a higher rank. His face was serious, his expression unreadable. He stopped in front of James. "Corporal Turner," the officer said firmly. "Did you move from your post?" James stood perfectly straight and answered clearly. "Yes, sir." The child was lost and in distress. "I made a decision to help." The officer said nothing for a long moment. The silence was heavy. People nearby held their breath. Even the mother stopped walking away and turned to listen. Then the officer took a slow breath and looked toward the little boy, now safe in his mother's arms. His tone softened slightly. "You made that decision on your own?" "Yes, sir," James said calmly. "It was my choice." The officer looked at him for another long second. His expression didn't change, but then he gave a faint nod. "Understood," he said quietly. "Stay alert at your post." And with that, he turned and walked away. It was a small moment, but James could sense the respect hidden behind the officer's neutral tone. The message was clear. Though protocol had been broken, compassion had spoken louder than any rule. As the crowd began to drift away, some tourists walked past James, whispering words of thanks. "You did a good thing," one man said. Another added softly, "That's real service, mate." A young woman near the front waved at him with a smile. "You're a hero in that uniform," she said quietly before leaving. James remained still, his expression unchanged, but those words echoed in his heart. He wasn't a man who sought attention or applause, but seeing the mother and son disappear safely into the crowd gave him a feeling of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. A few moments later, another guard leaned slightly toward him and whispered under his breath, "You've got courage, Turner." Not many would have done that. James didn't reply. He simply blinked once, his gaze steady on the horizon. Inside, though, he felt a deep sense of calm. The world outside the palace gates had its rules, its noise, and its endless rush. But sometimes, in rare moments like this, humanity quietly took the lead. Hours passed, and the rest of the guard's shift continued as usual. The changing of the guard ceremony began soon after, and James marched in perfect rhythm, his boots striking the ground in unison with his team. To any outsider, he looked like the same stoic soldier as before, but something inside him had changed. A small reminder that even in the most disciplined life, kindness still had a place. That evening, as the sun began to set and the palace grounds grew quiet again, James returned to the barracks. The day's events were already spreading through the palace staff. Someone had mentioned that tourists were posting videos online. Others said local news stations were already talking about the royal guard with a heart. James didn't check his phone or the news. He sat quietly at his bunk, polishing his boots as always. One of his fellow guards sat beside him and said, "You know this will be everywhere by tomorrow." James gave a small smile. "Then maybe," he said softly, "the world will remember that being human doesn't make you less of a guard." Later that night, before he went to bed, he called home. His wife answered, and in the background he could hear his son Ethan's laughter. "How was your day?" she asked. James hesitated for a moment, then smiled to himself. "It was different," he said simply. "But it reminded me why I do this job." Ethan's small voice came through the phone. "Did you stand still all day, Daddy?" James chuckled softly. "Almost, buddy," he said. "But sometimes even Daddy has to move for something important." His wife laughed quietly. "That sounds like a story I'll be hearing in the news soon." James smiled. "Maybe," he said. "But as long as a child is safe tonight, that's all that matters." When he hung up, he sat in silence for a while, the faint hum of the barracks filling the air. Outside, the palace lights glowed softly under the night sky. Somewhere beyond those gates, a little boy was sleeping safely beside his mother. And that thought was enough for James. He didn't know that by morning, the world would be talking about him. He didn't know his picture would appear in newspapers, or that millions of people would call him the kind guard. All he knew was that for one brief moment in his life, he had chosen compassion over custom, and it had made all the difference. The next morning came quietly over London. A soft mist hung above the streets, and the city began to stir with the sound of buses, footsteps, and morning chatter. Inside the palace barracks, James woke up early, as he always did. He moved quietly, polishing his boots until they shone and pressing his red uniform with care. To him it was another day of duty, but the world outside had already changed. When he stepped into the hallway, a few fellow guards nodded at him. Some gave a faint smile. Others simply looked at him with quiet respect. James wasn't sure what to make of it until one of them said, "You've gone famous, Turner." "Famous?" James asked, puzzled. His friend chuckled. "Haven't you checked your phone? The internet's gone mad. There's videos of you helping that lost kid. Millions of views already." James blinked in surprise. He hadn't even thought about the cameras. "Millions?" "Yeah," the man said, grinning. "You're everywhere. The guard who broke silence, that's what they're calling you." James didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to attention, let alone the kind that stretched across the whole world. For him, it had simply been a moment of instinct, not heroism. He had only done what felt right, but it seemed the world saw it differently. Later that morning, as James walked toward the parade ground, he noticed a few reporters standing near the palace gates. They weren't allowed to come close, but he could see them holding microphones waiting for statements. Behind them, a crowd had gathered with curious faces pointing toward the guards. Some even waved. James kept walking, his step steady, his mind calm. He was proud, but also cautious. He knew the palace took its image seriously. He hoped no one thought he had disrespected the uniform. When he reached the main office, his commanding officer was waiting for him. The man stood tall, his hands behind his back, his face calm but unreadable. "Corporal Turner," he said firmly. "Come in." James entered the room, standing straight. "Sir." The officer looked at him for a moment, then gestured for him to sit. "You know why you're here?" "Yes, sir." "Because I left my post, that's right," the officer said. "You know the rules. Guards do not move unless commanded. It's been that way for centuries." "Yes, sir," James said quietly. The officer paused, then leaned back slightly. "But I've also seen the reports. I've seen the footage, and I've seen the faces of that mother and her son." His expression softened slightly. "You did something rare, Turner. You showed the human side of this job. And frankly, the world needed to see that." James felt a weight lift from his chest. "Thank you, sir." The officer nodded. "You'll receive no punishment. In fact, there's talk upstairs that your actions brought more respect to the guards than any parade in years. You reminded people that behind the uniform, there's compassion. The palace appreciates that." James sat quietly for a moment, taking it in. He hadn't expected praise, only understanding. To hear that his act had touched people, even those inside the palace, was more than enough. That afternoon, the palace press office released an official statement. It read, "The Royal Guard's first duty is protection. Corporal Turner's compassionate actions reflect the heart of that mission, to ensure safety and comfort for all, especially the vulnerable." News channels around the world covered the story. They showed the moment James had stepped out of formation, knelt beside the crying boy, and reunited him with his mother. The clip was replayed on morning shows and shared by countless people online. Some called it the day duty met kindness. Others wrote messages of gratitude. One message said, "He showed that true strength lies not in standing still, but in knowing when to move." James's phone was full of messages from people he hadn't heard from in years. Friends, fellow soldiers, even teachers from his youth. His wife sent him a message that simply said, "So proud of you. Ethan says his dad is a hero." That message made him smile quietly to himself. At home that evening, James sat in his small kitchen, reading through the kind comments people had left online. "This man restored my faith in humanity," one person wrote. Another said, "I visited the palace years ago and always thought the guards were emotionless. Now I know they're human too." James scrolled through each message slowly, humbled. He didn't feel like a hero, just a man who listened to his heart when it mattered. The following day, something unexpected happened. He received a sealed envelope with the royal emblem. Inside was a short note written in elegant handwriting. It read, "Corporal Turner, your act of compassion embodies the true spirit of service. You have reminded the world that kindness and duty can stand together, with gratitude on behalf of the royal household." There was no signature, but the message was enough. It was clear the note came from someone high within the palace, maybe even the royal family themselves. James held it for a long time, his heart full. A few days later, when James returned to duty, the crowd outside the palace seemed different. Tourists who recognized him whispered his name softly. Children waved at him from behind the fence. Some parents pointed him out to their kids, saying, "That's the guard who helped the lost boy." He didn't respond or move, he stayed still as always, but deep inside, he smiled. During his break that afternoon, a young father approached him quietly near the gates, holding his daughter's hand. The man said, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you did for that boy reminded me that there's still good people in the world. My daughter watched your video and said she wants to be brave like you." James gave a small nod. "Thank you, sir," he said politely. "That means a lot." The man smiled, shaking his hand before walking away. That evening, when James finished his shift, the air outside was cool and calm. He walked along the palace wall, looking out over the city lights. For years, he had thought his job was about silence and stillness, about standing guard and following orders without question. But now he realized it was more than that. His duty wasn't just to stand, it was to serve with a heart. He thought of the little boy, safe with his mother, probably back home laughing about his adventure. He thought of his own son, who would grow up one day and learn that strength wasn't just about standing tall, but about stepping forward when someone needed you. That night, James sat by his window, the royal letter resting on his desk. Outside, Big Ben chimed softly in the distance. He watched the lights flicker over the city and smiled. The world had seen one of the most disciplined guards show his heart, and instead of scolding him, they celebrated him. It was proof that sometimes humanity could shine even through the stiffest traditions. And as he turned off the light and prepared for another day of duty, James whispered quietly to himself, "For service, for country, for people." Then he smiled again, knowing that no matter how many years passed, people would remember the day when a royal guard broke silence, not out of disobedience, but out of love. A few days later, Buckingham Palace was once again full of life. Tourists crowded near the gates, smiling, taking photos, and pointing at the guards. Among them stood Corporal James Turner, tall and composed in his bright red uniform. From a distance, he looked like every other guard, silent, motionless, disciplined. But for many who visited that week, James was not just a guard anymore. He was the guard, the one whose small act of kindness had touched the hearts of millions. People who had seen the video came from far away just to catch a glimpse of him. Parents lifted their children so they could see the man who had helped a little boy like them. Some waved, some whispered. Others just watched quietly, smiling. But James, faithful to his role, didn't move or respond. Only his eyes told a quiet story. The story of a man who had chosen compassion over rules and found honor in doing so. Inside the palace, his name was being spoken with respect. The palace staff, the officers, even senior officials had all read the report about what happened that day. Some said his actions brought a human warmth to the image of the royal guard. Others said it reminded them what true service really meant. One afternoon, while James was resting between shifts, his commanding officer entered the room holding a small envelope. "Turner," he said, "a message for you." James stood and accepted it. The envelope carried the royal crest again. Inside, he found another short note. This time it said, "Your act of kindness has reflected the best of our traditions. You stood not only as a guard of the palace, but as a guardian of compassion. You have our gratitude." Below the message was a simple signature and an elegant seal. James stared at the note in silence. He didn't know what to say. He had never expected this. His fellow guards looked on proudly. One of them smiled and said, "Well, mate, looks like breaking the rules paid off." James laughed softly, shaking his head. "No," he said quietly. "It wasn't about breaking anything. It was about remembering what matters most." The news continued to spread for weeks. Newspapers printed headlines like, "The Kind Guard Who Melted Hearts" and "When Duty Meets Humanity." Television hosts spoke about him. A few journalists even requested interviews, but the palace declined politely. The story itself was enough. It didn't need words from the man who lived it. At home, James's wife proudly showed their son the newspaper articles. Ethan's eyes widened as he looked at the photos of his father standing beside the palace gate. "That's you, Daddy," he said with excitement. "You helped a little boy." James smiled warmly. "Yes, I did. He was scared, just like you were at the fair that day, remember?" Ethan nodded. "You're brave, Daddy. I want to be like you when I grow up." Those words meant more to James than all the headlines in the world. He leaned down, kissed his son's forehead, and said softly, "Always be kind, Ethan. That's the bravest thing you can ever be." A week later, when James returned to duty, a quiet drizzle covered London. The air was cool and clean, the sky gray but peaceful. He stood again at his post, his rifle at his side, his gaze steady. The tourists walked by under umbrellas, some recognizing him and smiling. One little girl waved shyly and said, "Thank you for helping the boy." Her parents smiled and nodded in gratitude. James didn't speak, but his eyes softened. Deep down, he felt something gentle, a reminder that small acts of goodness never disappear. They live on in the hearts of those who witness them. Later that day, during a short break, one of the palace staff members approached him quietly. It was the same woman who had escorted the mother and child off the grounds after that emotional reunion. She smiled as she handed James a folded piece of paper. "A letter came for you," she said. James unfolded it carefully. It was from the boy's mother. The letter read, "Dear Corporal Turner, I don't know how to thank you. That day was the most frightening moment of my life. I looked away for only a few seconds and my son vanished in the crowd. When I saw you holding his hand, I knew he was safe. You didn't just comfort a lost child. You comforted a mother's heart. Oliver still talks about the tall soldier who saved him. He keeps saying he wants to be brave like you when he grows up. With all my heart, thank you." At the bottom of the letter was a small drawing, crayon lines made by a child's hand. It showed a little boy holding the hand of a tall guard in a red uniform. The sky was blue, the sun was bright, and both figures were smiling. Beneath it were the words written in uneven letters. "Thank you, Mr. Guard. From Oliver." James stared at the drawing for a long moment. It was simple, but to him it was more precious than any metal. He folded the letter gently and placed it inside his pocket, close to his heart. That evening, as he stood for the final watch of the day, the rain stopped, and the clouds parted. The setting sun cast a golden glow on the palace walls. Everything looked peaceful again. The flag above the palace fluttered softly in the wind. Tourists began to leave, their footsteps fading into the distance. The city lights slowly came alive. James stood silently, his figure tall and proud against the golden light. He thought about everything that had happened, the lost boy, the mother's tears, the applause, and the letters. None of it had been planned. It was just one small decision, made from the heart, but that one choice had touched thousands of lives. He realized then that rules were important, but they were never meant to erase kindness. True discipline was not just about standing still. It was about knowing when to act. True strength wasn't silence, it was compassion. And true duty wasn't only to the crown, it was also to humanity. When his shift ended, James took one last look at the palace. The gates glowed softly under the evening lamps and the air smelled of rain and stone. He walked slowly toward the barracks, his boots echoing on the wet ground. As he passed a group of tourists leaving the area, a young boy ran up to him and waved shyly. "Are you the guard from the video?" the boy asked, his mother smiling behind him. James paused and looked down. "Yes," he said softly. "That was me," the boy grinned. "You're my hero." James smiled kindly and said, "Thank you, young man. But remember, heroes are just people who choose to do the right thing." The boy nodded proudly, and his mother whispered a quiet thank you before leading him away. James continued walking, his heart full. When he reached his room, he placed the child's drawing and the royal letter together on his desk. They looked simple side by side, but to him, they meant everything. One represented the honor of duty, and the other represented the warmth of humanity. Both together told the story of who he truly was. That night, before going to sleep, James stood by the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and he could hear the faint sound of traffic below. He thought about the people he served, the visitors, the citizens, the children who looked up to him. And he whispered quietly to himself, "If I can guard hearts as well as walls, then I've done my job right." The world would move on. New stories would come. New faces would appear at the palace gates. But this one moment, the day a royal guard broke protocol to comfort a crying child, would live in people's memories for years to come. It would remind them that even in the most silent places, kindness can speak louder than words. And so, every morning when Corporal James Turner stood once again in his post, motionless and proud, there was something different in his stillness. Behind the quiet strength, behind the polished uniform and the solemn face, there was a heartbeat that carried a simple truth, that humanity and duty can stand side by side, and that compassion, even in silence, can change the world.